So I hope you all enjoyed your dinner. You are getting dessert service, the famous Fonda pudding, created by the original chef of Fonda, Conrad Aljair, who has his own great story. Anyway, if you're back to us and you want to turn around, this would be a really good time to do that. And if you just want to walk around your table a few times, that would be a good time to do that. So some of you are new to this, and some of you have been to some of our events, but those of you who've been to some of our events, you know that for many of the Fred Harvey events that we've done here in Santa Fe, one of the highlights of the events have been during the Q&A when Daggett Harvey Jr. stands up and explains what an idiot I am. Normally, he raises an issue, which is a fair issue, and it's a conversation that he and I have been having like for 10 years now.
5.
Daggett, well, even before the book came out, Daggett and his late wife were incredibly helpful to me in the creation of this book. And towards the end of the writing of it, he realized that the book was going to stop in Fred Harvey history before the moment that he joined the company. Yeah. That I considered the golden years to have ended before he got there. So that was a problem.
That was your problem.
And that was my problem. Yeah. And I must say, writing about a family, and the Harveys have been incredibly generous with me over the years, but it has been interesting meeting them and answering their questions about their own family, which is a really interesting process, which is still going on, and we're all still learning things about Fred Harvey. So every year at this time, we've been having Harvey events, and Daggett has raised issues about the post-war Fred Harvey Company and my complete ignorance of its importance. And so we decided, this was actually Meredith's idea, that we would actually program an event that was going to focus on that time period for two reasons. One, so that Daggett will stop heckling me at later Harvey events.
Yeah, well said.
But secondly, because we do over-focus on the older time period, even though in terms of Santa Fe and in terms of the Southwest, much of what you guys all know about the Fred Harvey Company comes from that post-war period. And the story of how the Fred Harvey Company disappeared and came back kind of in our hearts and minds to be part of, now a very vibrant historical community really interested in the Fred Harvey story is one that Daggett can also give us access to. So I want to introduce you to Daggett Harvey Jr. Give him a round of applause. He finally gets on the stage. And before I start asking him some questions about his own experience in the company and his own experience with his family, I want to tell you just a little bit about the time period that we're talking about here. So just so you understand, we tend to focus in the Fred head world on the early years of the Harvey Company in the 1870s, 1880s, through the turn of the century, when the railroads first expanded into the West, when there were Harvey houses every 100 miles, and the Harvey Company revolutionized hospitality in the West and the hotel business nationally, and focus up through the period of the Depression, because after the Depression, things were different. Daggett was born, is it okay if I say that you were born in 1939?
Yeah. No.
So you were born in 1939, right? The family history I got said that you were.
That's right.
So keep in mind that by 1939, and some of you were born then or later, the Harvey Company had already made a pretty large change, meaning the Harvey Company for many decades had been based in Kansas City and spread all over the Southwest. During the Depression, some of the smaller Harvey houses closed because of economic reasons. And in the late 1930s, Daggett's grandfather took over the company from his aunt, who inherited the company after her father died and after her brother Freddie died. And the company was moved to Chicago in 1938, and it was run differently. People didn't necessarily notice that it was being run differently for the first 8 or 9 years because the war came, and the war required the Fred Harvey Company to expand again in a huge way. So all the old Harvey houses were reopened, and business was amazing. And then when the war ended, and then the Harvey Girls movie came out, and everybody thought this would be the next second great renaissance of Fred Harvey. There was this amazing, sad to us scene where Daggett's grandfather, Byron Sr., and Fred Gurley, who was the president of the Santa Fe Railroad, went on a railroad train, just the two of them, just an engine and them in a passenger car, and they went along the line from Chicago and got as far as Gallup, and at that point Fred Gurley said, these Harvey houses will all close. And they turned around and came back, and the Harvey chain, as we knew it, in terms of having dozens of locations all through Kansas, through Colorado, through New Mexico and Arizona, ceased to exist. And the Harvey Company became a much smaller company focused in the large union stations and in a handful of large institutions in the Southwest, including La Fonda, including the Grand Canyon, and the Grand Canyon was the biggest moneymaker in the chain. So just so you understand, that's how the Fred Harvey Company changed. And the company that Daggett and his living relatives grew up in was the company run by Byron Sr. and his three sons, the youngest of whom was Daggett's father, Daggett Sr. And they had to run the company and make it relevant for the 50s, the 60s, and the 70s, when they already had competition from Howard Johnson's.
No.
They were no longer the only company of their kind in the country. Daggett says no, but other people have said yes. Daggett disagrees with me about everything.
Yeah.
That's why we're
That's
giving
right.
him his own microphone.
No.
Anyway, what I wanted to start with was for you to tell us what your earliest memories are as a kid of like growing up around Fred Harvey, about the company, around the ethos of the company. What do you remember? You were telling us earlier some of your earliest memories were from here.
So is this
Is he on?
all right?
Can you hear him?
No, you can't hear me. Can you? Hear me? You can pass me. You can pass me. Oh, there I am.
There, now you got the voice
And
of
welcome.
God.
Well, where shall I start? We are lucky because when this man came to me almost 10 years ago and said he was inspired by a picture of my great-grandfather at El Tovar. So I look at him with the jaundiced eye and I think, well, I've heard this before, and they usually end up, at best, in a master's thesis that goes into a library that was probably lost or burnt down. But he was a good salesman, as you notice. And most of what he says is absolutely true. But no one could have been more fortunate to find a man more gifted and better research and a better storyteller on a fascinating subject than this man. So he should be here, and this should be Dinner with Stephen, which I thought for a while it was going to be. But I would applaud him for being here very much. And none of us would be here. There would be no Fred Harvey Renaissance, at least not right now, because good things will rise to the surface, if he hadn't have brought it out, if he hadn't have seen things. Like Stephen, the eye of a poet in a concierge, the eye of a poet in a writer. He sees things that other people did not see. He saw things in the portrait. He saw things in the company. He may have even seen good things in the reflections that he saw of the mirror of the ancient Fred Harvey. And I'm here in part to talk about those things that happened that he doesn't know as much about, particularly 1960 to 1986 when the company was sold, and even a little bit after, because I was there a little bit after. But back to the question. First memories are right here, 1946, and going up to Taos and paying somebody 25 cents to take their picture and seeing things I'd never seen before, a sky I'd never seen, and pueblos I'd never thought of. It was for the marriage of my uncle coming home from World War II to his aunt up in Denver, and we came here in part to see La Fonda, because my father had just joined Fred Harvey. He had been a lawyer and a Brightman II, a Phi Beta Kappa at Yale and a Northwestern Law School, and he'd been in the United States Navy. And then he'd left the Navy when the war was over and joined Fred Harvey. And I think part of probably to catch up, because he was kind of lost some time in the Navy about what was going on in Fred Harvey, he came to the Southwest, and also, by the way, to pick up a new car, which, as you know, weren't being made in 1941 through 1945. And my first memories, and that's your question, is seeing the brilliance of this country, New Mexico, this land of genuinely well-known land of enchantment. To see it, how magnificent it was, and to wonder about it. And La Fonda my heart is here, and I remember tears that I had when we sold this in about, 1986, just before the sale of the whole company, the precursor of bad things, I think, in many ways. Long answer to a short question.
What about Chicago, which is where you grew up in Chicago? Yes?
I grew up in Chicago. I spent almost all of my Fred Harvey life, which is about 8 years in Chicago, in an extended training program. I started in 1960 in college summers in 1961, and worked in a lot of the restaurants. I worked in about 15 locations in and around the Chicago area. I worked particularly on the Illinois Toll Road, which, although you might believe otherwise, was a very major moneymaker and successful.
Wait, does everybody know about the toll roads?
I will tell them. I will tell them.
Explain some of the later Harvey businesses that people in the Southwest maybe don't know so much about.
Well, in the late 40s and the early 50s, it became apparent that the railroads were not a great growth business. So starting with my uncle, Byron Harvey, and then another question which may come up, giving away the day-to-day management of the company to others, Charlie Hunter and then Leslie Scott, it became obvious you have to diversify and take what talents you have and put them in other directions, because if you don't reinvent yourself, which is true in any business, you're going to die. So I think they saw that, and I think they should get credit for it. And so at the Grand Canyon, they built new facilities, which were very successful and very profitable. In the Illinois Toll Road, they acquired the concession, which was the most profitable and the best-run toll road country in the United States. 5 oases, built differently than any others. And so we took the sous chef of the George Sank, put him in charge, and people would come from all around, can you believe it, to go on the Illinois Toll Road to get their best dinners that they could in the Chicago suburbs.
Do some of you know what these restaurants were like? Because they were very cool. If you saw the recent Coen Brothers movie, Inside Llewyn Davis, there's a scene in one of the toll, but they were very futuristic. They were up above the toll roads, which is pretty unusual, not what we have in the East.
Correct, yeah.
And the buildings were pretty cool and architecturally significant, besides the fact that the food was interesting.
So the question was about what we did.
But I was actually asking what you remember being a kid in Chicago.
Oh,
being around
glorious.
the station there and being around Fred Harvey operation there, which was huge.
Well,
right?
more of it was coming out of town.
Right.
Because we had we had some somewhat pedestrian restaurants in business areas in Chicago as a child. The excitement was to come here, particularly the Grand Canyon, which was my father's area of special interest. Stuart Harvey had particular interest in New Mexico, and Byron Harvey, my father's 2 brothers in California, and they could squabble about the Midwest, Cleveland, Chicago, Kansas City, St. Louis, the Union stations. It was still railroad-oriented then, and the treat that the older people here may remember before Amtrak was to ride the train. The Eastern trains, yes, they were good. The Western trains, they were much better. Union Pacific was good, and we were better. The Santa Fe was a magnificent train, a magnificent railroad to ride. And they paid us a lot of money to lose them a lot of money, which was a good trip. And that continued up until the disasters of Amtrak.
So tell us a little bit about how your dad got involved with the business and what besides geographically, what were his areas of what did he do? I mean, there were so you understand, Byron Sr. took over the company, and he had 3 sons. And your father was the youngest.
Byron was gifted and trained with Carson Peary, Scott, and I think he was a genuinely artistically creative man. His particular area of interest was retail, and he had been working for Fred Harvey his whole life. Stuart was interested in the back of the house. There's a couple of stories with him that if someone complained, in fact, the story I heard from my father, not from Stuart, was somebody said the soup wasn't very warm, he'd stick his finger in it and say, "Oh, you're right," and send it back to the kitchen. My father was a lawyer, and a good one. And after World War II, his father, Byron Sr., said, "We need you. Come on into the company." That's as much as I know. My father was a modest man and didn't go into any detail, but it was clear that he was needed. And I think he was needed in the law, and I want to think more than that, because he had a brilliant mind, a very analytical mind, not necessarily an entrepreneurial mind. And I will be critical tonight, if you'll bear with me, particularly my sister and my cousins, to be, I think, appropriately critical of my parents with perfect Monday morning quarterback. So you'll forgive me that, because it's easy to say what might have been and what could have been. That he was requested to come into the company, I believe, because of his legal and his other talents. And his area, as I said, was Arizona, as it turned out.
And interestingly, I will say, and I'm not the first historian, as if I'm a historian, to notice this, but your dad ended up being the one who preserved a lot of the family's history, even though he was the youngest. I mean, when I look at the files and the work that people did that later became the things that we could work on, your dad's files were the great files.
Yes.
He sat down. I thought it was actually quite fascinating when you get the date books, which are now in the museum's collection, and we separated all these notes out. But when I got them from you, we found them in your basement. That's a whole other story. They were full of notes that your dad had written and had paper clipped in.
Yes.
Because he was fascinated by Fred Harvey's old journals. I think he was probably the first one in the family to kind of realize what they were and pay attention to them. And he had made all these notes of what things were interested by him, and he had also written down other notes that when people didn't have access to the date books, they would use your dad's notes. I mean, some of the things that they used for the Heard Museum show in the 1990s, because they couldn't get access to the date books, were actually your dad's notes.
Yes.
So your dad had a really great interest in the family's history as well. Now, do you remember one of the turning points for your dad and your era's business is that the family in the early 1950s bought the Grand Canyon operation from the Santa Fe Railroad. So just so you understand, I mean, before that, the railroad owned all the buildings, and the railroad controlled all of it. The railroad didn't want to be in that business anymore, but the biggest reason that we still talk about Fred Harvey today is because Stewart's grandfather and his father and his brothers arranged to buy the entire South Rim operation for $2 million in, I believe, I have the date here somewhere. It was in the early 1950s.
I think so. Why did they, is the question?
I'm wondering if you remember this, if you remember why they did it and what the thinking was, because it's a pretty bold move for a company that had never owned anything before.
Sometimes I can tell you, in fact, and some things I can tell you from
Just make it up.
the cloudy. Well, why should I? Nonfiction writers do. Yeah, it's part of apparently writing. But I think the answer was that you had a concession with the United States government, 30-year concession. And if we'd lost that at any time, whether it was in 1955, 65, 75, or 45, it would have been very damaging. A large part, even a majority from time to time of the company's profits came from the Grand Canyon. One of the ways, which has come up recently, and I'm not clear on these details, that you protected yourself was to own the properties. So if someone else got the contract, great, but they didn't own the hotels. They didn't own the restaurants. They didn't own the mules. They didn't own the gas stations. So I think it was an act of protection on the part of Fred Harvey, is my understanding, and it makes sense. And in fact, it's been invoked in the last 12 months.
Yeah, so for those of you who've been following what's been happening with the contract at the Grand Canyon, it all harkens back to the original ownership of Fred Harvey and their ownership of those buildings. And our friends at Xanterra did just finally make that deal. You must have gone to Grand Canyon a lot when you were a kid. And you told me a story later, am I remembering this right, that you had to negotiate with the mule union, with the mule handlers union?
Yeah. First went down the canyon in 48, terrified. But I got to the bottom, and it's so exciting, and it's so hot when you leave in July, and it's 32 degrees, and there's snow all over, and you're terrified. You get down there, and you remember this, Jeannie, and you get down there, and you're hot, and it's because desert down there, and you go in the pool. But the pool is ice melt, and it's 34 degrees. That is a memory that I won't. Second, flash forward to 1965 or so, 66. From an ancient contract that had said that I inherited, I was then Director of Industrial Relations and Personnel, which meant I negotiated the labor contracts for the company. And the company's about half union, of 5,000 employees. About 2,500 roughly were union in the big cities. But as some strange afterthought event, the transportation workers in the Grand Canyon, the bus drivers, and anybody involved in transportation were union. Now, Arizona's right-to-work law state, which means you don't have to be a member, which is a nightmare for unions. If that's a nightmare, imagine having cowboys as your clients. You have to represent a cowboy, the most independent soul in American history. And so I can only imagine, and I've heard in part, that the big boy from Los Angeles who runs the United Transportation Union in the whole western United States comes out from Los Angeles and meets with the truck drivers or bus drivers. They don't give much trouble. And he sits down with the cowboys. And he says, we want to hear what you want for your demands. And the number one demand I got is that Representative Fred Harvey's, we want no more holy blankets. I thought, because it was spelled with an H, not with a W. What are we doing? We're putting some kind of Navajo holy blankets on our mules? Oh, I'm sorry, Mr. We didn't spell it right. Your blankets were holy, and we were requested to put saddles on those blankets and ride them down to Phantom Ranch. No, I mean, this is just, talk about the cowboy idea. I mean, it was my mule first. It was just one of just many bizarre things that happened at Grand Canyon.
You bring up the unions, and that's an interesting issue. I would say that the period that I wrote about was mostly pre-union, although the unions became more important to the company in the 20s and 30s. But when you talk about the company, when Stewart talks about the company, there's a lot of discussion of unions.
Yeah.
So can you explain, in that later part of the Fred Harvey company, what was unionized, what wasn't, and what places were hard? I mean, you were also working in Chicago. You had to deal with the mob. It wasn't just unions. You were dealing with the mob. I mean, it was a hard, some of these cities were hard places. Cleveland, Chicago, Kansas City, Los Angeles. These are not easy places to deal with unions or to deal with labor in general.
It was interesting, and I want to come back to this. Somebody remind me if I forget, but the most moving thing was right here in this hotel. This is a different situation. But in Cleveland, you talked with Jackie Presser, and I flew over there to negotiate a contract that covered the Cleveland Union Station. We had 150 or 180 employees there. And he was restless. He'd run the Teamsters Union. He was a protege of Jimmy Hoffa. And I got there, I was feeling sick. And by the time the middle of the night came around, I was very sick. And at 7 a.m. in the morning in my hotel, a doctor appeared. I hadn't called a doctor. Oh, Mr. Harvey, Mr. Presser, the union representative, sent him over here. In other words, as an act of kindness, which is not that rare, occasionally cases of liquor would come in from people that would later turn out to be somebody you're about to negotiate with. So the union knew what was going on, and then when you got there, and then another time in negotiating in Chicago with the retail clerks.
Wait, did they poison you first?
Sorry?
Did they poison you first and then send a doctor? Or they just heard you were sick?
No. And we were just small potatoes. Jackie Presser had nothing to do with this guy that paid union wages, and it was just, give me your usual 3%, and it wasn't hard. It was a slam bang dunk for him and for me too. The retail clerks, though, I guess they had learned from the same school. They would introduce themselves and be very polite, and they'd say, how's your family? I'd say, fine. They'd say, how's Laura and Leslie and Elizabeth and Carolyn? So I got the message that they knew where I was.
And where they lived.
Yeah. And I couldn't help the next time around to have done some homework and ask them how their wives and children were by name, too. It had to quid pro quo. There was never any violence exerted to be. There was sometimes suggestion that they take the whole country down, that is to say, Chicago, Kansas City, St. Louis, Cleveland, Los Angeles, in violation of Taft-Hartley, which each one is a separate bargaining unit. We were supposed to have a fight each one and settle it each way. We'd had a strike right before, the only strike we ever had at St. Louis, just before I became director of personnel. And in a way, that was the best thing that ever happened, because before that time, and this has happened to other companies, they didn't think we'd ever take a strike. We were a paternalistic company, and even Stuart Harvey said, we don't want to get into a fight with our employees, he told my predecessor at that time. And I got the feeling that we didn't want to, so this compromises me a little bit. But once you've taken a strike, they know you will, and then you're serious. You have some credibility. And it was lovely to have credibility because, and the good news and bad news, negotiator can always say, I have to go back and talk to the boss. They thought I was the boss, in great error, because I never was an officer of the company. But I had some credibility, in large part thanks to my father, which brings me back here. My father negotiated with a magnificent woman named Gussie Houlihan, and Bonnie, you told me, Bonnie's a Harvey girl here tonight. She remembers that name. Gussie Houlihan, unlike the lowlifes that I knew in Chicago, Cleveland, St. Louis, and Kansas City, by and large, she was something out of a movie. She represented her people. She could be trusted. She really fought for her people. And she represented the people in this hotel.
Harvey girls? The Harvey girls were unionized here?
Everybody, every union.
I like that concept.
All the workers in this hotel that were not supervisors, and in Alvarado, and in the airport. And it was just fine to negotiate with a woman who, while she was only about 60 years older than I was just just the finest woman I've ever known in the union movement, and there are those people. She would inspire anybody today.
Do you, speaking of important women in the company, did you meet Mary Coulter? Did you know Mary Coulter? What do you remember of
I
Mary
was really young. I remember only that my father and his brothers were slightly afraid of her. and when wow, what a powerhouse. And she would terrify the United Nations. She had it her way. Yes.
But did you meet her? Do you have an image?
I met her. I have vague childhood memories of her.
Right. I mean, you would have been 9 or 10 before
Right.
she left the company.
Right,
I mean, she
right.
was less active, I guess, after the late 1940s.
Yeah, she was, you're right. Steve, who should be here, not I, but he has sold, maybe secondhand, but they're absolutely true when people's terror and her attention to detail, which, when you think about it, was a reflection of the company and its strengths, that they paid attention to detail, how they bought, how they served, in every respect, how they laid out a place. It was a company that was not based on return of capital in the first 3 months or the first 3 years, but in doing things right and being there and being a trustee in a way. And this has good news and bad news. Having the public interest as your first motivation, and if you did it right, I think particularly Fred and Ford and Byron knew that, and our fathers. They acted maybe too much from a standpoint of making the most money as possible. But they acted as they were genuine trustees for the American people, whether it was in the national parks or whether it was serving on the Illinois Toll Road. And so that any implication that there was a disinterest in the quality of standards of the company is not true. These men, my father and his brothers, were extremely interested. I'll be the first to pick apart what, in retrospect, maybe they could have done better or didn't do right. But don't doubt for a minute that they wanted this company to be the servant of the people and to serve people properly, and as well as their father and their grandfather had done.
Do you remember when you were younger, there's a critique, I don't particularly subscribe to it, but there's a critique having to do with race, there's a critique having to do with the treatment of Native Americans, that I think has, over the years, depending on what decade we're talking about, becomes louder or quieter. But you've talked to me about some racial issues in Chicago.
Yes.
And certainly over the years there have been raised issues which I think are unfair but still get, bless you Meredith, just generally. The issues of whether the Fred Harvey company exploited Native American artists. So I'm wondering, again, I don't agree with this myself, but you've heard this probably many times in your life, and I wonder how it made you and other people in the family feel, and how you feel about it.
Some people believe if you buy something for $10 and sell it for $20, you're exploiting. Some people believe that any form of trade is exploitive. Some people believe that profits are inherently illegal or immoral. Quite clearly, Fred Harvey on the retail side and on the restaurant side did not believe that, nor did Ford, nor did Byron, nor did their fathers. It's so general to view yesterday's behavior with today's perfect hindsight, including today's morality about race and equal opportunity. I was there at a fascinating time in two ways. I saw the great black migration coming to Chicago when I ran Dearborn Station in the 60s. And I would see and I ran the station as a restaurant manager and saw the tensions, particularly in my employees, most of which were black by that time. The Crossroads room at Dearborn Station had been actually a copy of the pump room. The same designer had done it. Same little beautiful art scenes around the United States in a somewhat impressionistic fashion. But by 1965 or whenever I was there, it had been a different place. The railroads had crashed, and the trade coming in on the railroads was a different sort. It was the great black migration with a lot of whites coming north too. And in the employees, they felt it. A number of episodes. I remember when I walked into Dearborn Station, this company is not innocent of everything. When I went in there, I went down to the locker rooms and I saw, and this is in the north, not the south, I saw colored and white on the female locker rooms. And when I ended that, I said, that's got to end right now. And of course there was grumbles, and one employee, who interesting enough was neither white nor black, was the only one that quit, and it worked pretty well thereafter. It really wasn't bad at all. But I do remember a couple other stories. We had in Kansas City, before the Civil Rights Act, but at least before even the Executive Order 11246 that President Kennedy said, you will practice affirmative action and you will advertise for non-white employees. Before that, the barbers had come to us and said, we're getting black people in here and we're not serving them. And my father, who in this, for some reason, said, well, it's our company policy. We will cut everybody's hair, just as like we'll serve everybody lunch and sell them newspapers or whatever else they want to buy. And he said, well, Mr. Harvey, we can't do it. He said, why not? And they said, well, we don't know how. And he said, you better learn. And they said, well, we don't think we can learn. And I think it was within a week we closed that barbershop like that. Kansas City is on the edge of the South. Up until 1955, it was the law of the land in Texas that there be separate accommodations for whites and blacks. When you took a train, some of you may remember, you were on the Grand Canyon Limited that took the southern route through Oklahoma and Texas and went west and joined the Santa Fe and Balim. The curtains came down. You probably remember this. The curtain came down in the dining room. And it was a little shocking and surprising for a boy from Illinois to see what would happen when, and also the signs would go up on the coaches, colored and white, colored and white. So did we practice segregation? In Texas? Sure we did. It was the law. You couldn't operate in Texas. And before that, probably in Mississippi. I have no knowledge of that, but there were a few houses in Mississippi, I think, that you might know about.
We've seen some plans of houses that seem to have colored-only seating sections.
Yeah.
But then I've read stories about the lives of the houses, and they didn't do it. Meaning they had to put it on the plan because that was the law in the state.
Well,
But in fact, I've read stories about how the trains, obviously the houses in Texas were segregated, but that the trains weren't.
the trains were. I saw it.
But I'm saying that I think that they were, you may have seen it then, but it's possible that that changed in the 60s.
It did.
But it may have not been that way in the 30s and 40s. Meaning, because keep in mind also that there was different, there were different times for different racial things. I have to say, writing about the Fred Harvey Company, one of the hardest things about it is just how many decades you have to cover. And you have to remind yourself that the 20s is not the 30s, the 30s is not the 40s, the 60s is not the 50s. So every person's experience, to them, the whole time they were at Fred Harvey, they did that. But when you're writing about 100 years, you have to realize that you could meet somebody else who was there for a different 10 years when they did something completely differently.
That's why I'm here.
No, and I understand that. No, in a way, it would be great if we had a living person from each period, because I do think in this country there may have been less segregation in the 30s than there was in the 60s. When people were fighting against the Civil Rights Act. Mm-hmm. And so, it's interesting for that reason. Now, I'm curious for you to talk a little bit about, so the company was taken public in the 60s. You were working for the company then, or certainly old enough to be paying attention to it. So
director,
and it was right after your uncle Byron Jr. died. So Byron Jr. died in 1965. He was the heir apparent. He was the oldest. And your dad and your uncle Stuart were left as the main family representatives. And the next year, the family went public. The company went public, and then 2 years later, it was bought by another company.
Yeah.
So tell us about those things, why they happened, what they meant to the Harvey Company. Keeping in mind that in this time period, Fonda ended up being bought in 1968, right? So the company sold Fonda off after it was bought by AmFac in 1968. I don't know if it was at the same time or right after.
No.
Yes.
I think so. It was very close. It was very close, and it was very emotional for me to leave this place. I did go into the AmFac era. AmFac bought Fred Harvey, closed in 69. I left in 70. I thought that we left in just before, but
it's all pretty close in time.
It's very close, and that's not important. Why did they go public, and why did they sell? right? That's your question.
Wait, Steve has a.
Yeah, yeah, that's what I thought.
They bought it from the railroad, but interestingly, the railroad and the Harvey Company had a separate contract for this hotel from the very beginning when it started. It wasn't exactly the same. So just like the Union Station contracts for the Fred Harvey Company were different than the railroad run of the railroad contracts, La Fonda was owned a little bit differently. So yes, the railroad always owned the buildings. In fact, when the company bought the buildings of the Grand Canyon, it was the first time they had ever owned a building. And Daggett actually was the one who explained to me, as his dad explained to him, that part of the reason the company was not able to become completely modern with the whole company that it had was a fear of debt. And it would have at a certain point, if the railroads didn't want to run the buildings anymore, the Fred Harvey Company would have had to buy them and own real estate, which it was not really part of its business. It was a pure service business until it bought the Grand Canyon.
Well, we were spoiled. Santa Fe owned everything, we ran it for them. What a lovely way. You don't have your capital at risk. It's terrific. But there's good news and bad news about that. You have no benefits from inflation. You have no tax shelters from depreciation or amortization. And the question really is related somewhat to why we went public in '66 and why we sold out in '68. Byron Harvey dies. One reason. And there were two people of my generation, my cousin Billy, his daughter's here tonight, and I working for the company. And there were a lot of girls, including one here tonight. And there was, I think, an interest on the part of our fathers, Stuart, Byron, and my father, Daggett, that they have some liquidity in their estates. Their whole estate was involved in Fred Harvey stock. So number one, you create a public market by going public. And number two addresses a more interesting question, I think. The company never had a lot of capital. Since it never owned hotels, it never appreciated from depreciation. It had nice profits. It was all financed out of cash flow for two reasons. Major reason being there was an abhorrence, I think, in a depression-bred abhorrence to debt. Debt got people in trouble. Debt took people into bankruptcy. Why should we bet the farm when we're doing just fine as we are? And besides, the cash flows are good. So maybe in retrospect, as a mistake, if you wanted to be a Hilton or a Marriott or a Hyatt, you didn't borrow much money. A little bit, but not much. And besides, as you point out in the book, they'd already borrowed a certain amount of money to buy out, not force out, Catherine Harvey. Forcing is something you do by violence or threat of violence. It's not violent. We'll be back to that.
We'll come back to that. At next year's Kitty Harvey weekend.
Yes. So, make a long story boringly longer, we needed the capital, and Byron Harvey, and pretty soon his brothers knew they were going to die. They wanted to make their estates liquid so they could pay their taxes, so they could leave some money to their children who could invest it for some real income, because Fred Harvey wasn't paying very much dividends. It was financed out of cash flow. The cash had to go toward all those good things and some bad things that we did in the 60s.
So, now Stuart told me the story. I'm not sure that I've ever heard the story from you, and it was so interestingly emotional that at a certain point, your generation thought you would be the next generation to run Fred Harvey. And one day, your dads let you know that the company was going to be leaving family ownership, and that you would be able to have jobs there, but that you were not going to own the company anymore. So what was that like?
Stuart may have been a quicker study than I, and he left just before I came, my cousin, not my uncle. And he may have thought a lot about that. I was aware, somewhat at least, maybe not to the full degree of my deficiencies, but I had not thought a lot about, I wasn't dreaming that the company was going to be for sale. It made a lot of sense to go public, to create a public market. And one day I went around had an office in the West Side, and I went around to see my father. We'd have lunch occasionally, and we'd talk about family business and other stuff. And his secretary said, Margaret Anderson said, "He's not here." "Oh, well, where is he?" Well, she said, "I can't say." "You can't say because you don't know or because you cannot say?" She said, "I can't say." "Oh, that's interesting." So when he came back a few days later, you may remember this, Jeannie, he said, "Where have you been?" And he said, "Well, I've been in Hawaii." "Well, we're talking to this major Hawaiian company, this conglomerate, that has a real interest in Fred Harvey, and they want to merge with us. The word was never buy. The word was merge. Now, they were 5 to 10 times the size of Fred Harvey in market value. And, of course, it happened. But this is not the way you want to sell your company. When your children are interested and think they have a future in it. He sold it well. He said there's all kind of opportunities. They have great Hawaiian properties that they need people in the hotel business to work on. For we have the human capital and they have the dollar capital. So they can invest that we won't invest. And we have the people and we have the management and we have the leadership. Well, this is ridiculous because they had on Holidays is a company they already owned. It was a quite different culturally company who would squeeze the lemon so you could get not only the lemonade but 2 gallons of it over there in Hawaii doing it. We had a different set of standards. And when, within a year or two, that we stopped using Colombian coffee and started using Santos, or we stopped using bottle and bond whiskey and started to go to 4-year-old, or when we started cutting hamburger sizes and stopped buying U.S. Choice, but started buying U.S. Utility after the company was sold, I think I know he had nightmares when you sold the company. There was a certain naivete in our father on this merger with proper gentlemen who seemed very proper and who would honor the company's traditions. And when I went to the Grand Canyon and I made a speech that went something like this, you can trust me because I can trust my father and his brother and his father and his brother, and we're going to do this the way we've always done it. And within 3 years, they made me a liar. When you sell something, you can't keep it.
Do you remember that being painful for you? You said it was for your father. Was it for you?
Probably more for him than for me because I didn't have any part in the decision. And he did. Mm-hmm. He recognized Byron Harvey family's needs, which were liquidity, which were some income. I think that Stuart Harvey was all for merger more than my father, who was somewhat ambivalent. In the 60s, the market was wonderful. Things were going up. We got a lot of overtures. We'd been a public company. We got more attention. It was like the young woman who's chased after, and finally someone woos her properly, and she's swept off her feet. Is my
good Harvey girl analogy.
Yeah, thank you.
So effectively, at that point, your company had been sold to a company that didn't really care about the Fred Harvey name, or the Fred Harvey ethos didn't mean that much to them. And it slowly began to erode. I mean, you've talked to me about the Stewart and people who worked for the company at that time. Interestingly, the idea of a Fred head, I think, came from people at the Grand Canyon who saw themselves as people who were still Fred Harvey thinking people, even though the people who had bought Fred Harvey weren't as Fred Harvey thinking people as they were. And you have almost like a 20-year period when the Harvey idea stays in this kind of situation where you have people like Steve Wimmer, who inherited this. I mean, he came later, but yeah. You have people who understand the Harvey ethos, but work for a company that doesn't get Fred Harvey, doesn't get why it was special, doesn't get why it was unusual. And every year it seems to erode a little bit more. I mean, you were gone, but I'm saying I've interviewed people from that time.
I wasn't entirely gone. My father died in 1976, and in a mistake, one of their worst actions, they made me a director in his place of AmFac, the successor company. I think AmFac and I would agree on one thing, that wasn't a good idea. We honor Steve tonight because he represents memories, and he represents standards. He represents quality, and he has the eye of a poet, I think, as I've said. And there are a lot of those. But the bosses in New York Stock Exchange Company who had become much better known by buying Fred Harvey were interested and overly diversified. They had some of the same problems we were getting into by going off in all directions. They went off in land management. They were running a hotel company. They were running a retail company, a very good one. They were running a distribution company for GE, all this in Hawaii. And they were going off in too many directions. Well, we, in our efforts to diversify, to reinvent ourselves, were reinventing ourselves not in what we were really good at, but in what we thought the future would lead to: industrial catering, in-flight feeding, spots around the country that would do highway feeding. But going off in too many directions and not committing the capital necessary for any one of them to be dominant or successful.
So after you left, when did you start noticing that there was beginning to be a groundswell of people who were romanticizing the past of Fred Harvey, wanted to recapture the history? I mean, I know when I met you that you had been through a lot of people who said they were going to write books about Fred Harvey, decades of people who said they were going to write books and make movies about Fred Harvey. So I'm wondering what the beginnings of what we now see as you guys are the Fredhead Nation. I mean, this is a real thing now. But it was a fantasy of a handful of people for a long time. So I'm wondering what the early years of the revival of Fred Harvey interest and Mary Coulter interest, what you remember about them.
Well, if the embryonic history, if this is the Renaissance, and I think that's my word, the Renaissance of Fred Harvey history, Renaissance is a rebirth. And in a birth, there's a father. And the father of the Renaissance is sitting right next to me. So, with a general American appreciation of its own history and a general regret that we've torn down too many buildings, destroyed too many stories, particularly in the buildings are obvious in every major American city, we've torn down things we wish we hadn't have. So now this room is filled with people that know that. And along comes someone who can tell a story, a good story, at the right time, in the right way, who acknowledges this. And it's almost formulaic that it's going to happen.
Well, you're giving me way too much credit. I mean, that's very nice.
Wait, there's something else to come, too.
Okay.
I'll get back to that. But no, not right now.
Do you remember the Alvarado being knocked down?
I had negotiated labor contracts thinking we were going to be there forever, even though I would offer, I think I told the story, I would offer to give the union representative the keys, and she, Gussie Houlihan, would decline, and we'd go through this little ritual because we weren't making any money there, and I've said, whatever you want, it's going to bankrupt. I didn't know how right my words were because within a few years it was a parking lot. So I was gone when they tore it down. I didn't think that was going to happen. I thought, I guess at the time I just wanted to get a 3-year labor contract that would not result in a strike. You know.
Well, I will say, and I know that going through the records, when I inherited a lot of the records, the truth is that obviously the people at the Heard Museum had done incredible work in the 1990s to first start telling the story again. And there were obviously Alan and Tina taking over at La Posada made a huge difference and created a place where more and more people were interested in this. Interestingly, during that time, I think La Fonda was less interested in its Harvey history during that time for a variety of reasons. But by the time that I started coming here, it had already rediscovered that. They had found Steve, and other people here, were sort of insidiously doing that. And actually, at the South Rim, it's the same thing. You have people who were there. It's like, we're real Fred Harvey people. We're waiting for the people who own us to understand that this is a cool thing.
Yeah.
And the people at Xanterra, well before my book came out, suddenly realized much later that owning Fred Harvey was cool. That Fred Harvey was actually a brand that was about all the things they wanted to be known for. And you've seen in their corporate culture sort of a battle to see, can we make Fred Harvey more of a thing? So I think it was happening, but it's happening more now. And there's a lot more to discover. I mean, we are happy that Jenny owns the hotel now, and her group owns the hotel. We are happy that Xanterra has a new 15-year contract for the Grand Canyon, so they will be willing to invest more and more in Fred Harvey and Mary Coulter history there because it is to their benefit. And we are happy that Las Vegas, New Mexico, when I first came here to do a Fred Harvey event in 2010 at the United World College, the conversation was, could you get that woman out of that building? Because we have been waiting for 25 years for somebody to go in the Castaneda, and it seemed like something that would never happen. And the fact that it's happened and the Castaneda is being refurbished and that it's being run with the Plaza is a miraculous thing, a wonderful thing. So there's a lot, we're just at the beginning of this. And I think it's great that the Harvey family has been able to use this as a good excuse for reunions. So I hope that we will have a Fredhead weekend like this every October. It also gives us a good excuse to come here and fish and eat all the good food of New Mexico. So before I ask you to sort of give us a nice summation so we can finish our dinner, I will say that for those of you who don't know, this is the opening event of a 4-day Fred Harvey weekend, and both here and in Las Vegas. but it is the combination of La Fonda and the New Mexico History Museum that makes this all possible. So we will be reconvening in Las Vegas on Saturday at the what's the name of the theater? The Ilfeld Auditorium, which is owned by the same Ilfeld family that owned the building that became the side building from the Plaza Hotel, at 2 o'clock for a screening of Katrina's film, Harvey Girls Opportunity Bound, some of which was filmed here, and then some of her new interviews of Harvey Girls. There will be a Fred Harvey dinner at the Plaza Hotel tomorrow night starting at 5 o'clock, Saturday night starting at 5 o'clock, during which at the cocktail hour they will debut the new Membreno mugs. Kathy, this is your moment, raise the mug. So a new company is going to start making replicas of Membreno china that will be wonderful and the right color, and they're American. It'll be made in Tucson, and the first ones that anybody can have in the country will be auctioned off during the cocktail part of our dinner in Las Vegas. And then we will come back here on Sunday for an event not dissimilar from the first event that started all of this, an afternoon event at the beautiful New Mexico History Museum in their wonderful underground auditorium, which I once had to speak in when all the lights were out. Some of you were there for that day. And we will have a panel. We will see some more of Katrina's interviews. I will talk a little bit about Harvey history. Alan Affelt will come and talk about the restoration of La Posada and the Castaneda. And Meredith will talk to us as well. And so that's going to be this year's Fred Harvey weekend. And I hope to see a lot of you. Kathy is raising her hand. Yes, yeah. Kathy. Oh, yes. And for those of you who either live here or want to come back to Arizona in 2 weeks, on November 4th, there's a new Fred Harvey exhibit at the NAU Klein Library Special Collections. They own the collection that was originally collected at the Grand Canyon by the Nails. And in fact, Alan Nail, who used to run the Grand Canyon for AmFac, is going to be on the panel with us. They are doing a show of Fred Harvey there. It opened last week, so you can go there anytime. But there is an event on November 4th for that.
Can we let people ask questions?
Yes, we can have people ask. I'm sorry. Yes. Do people have questions?
There might be.
Do you have questions? Can you make up questions? Steve.
The building we're going to be in Saturday on the Ilfeld Auditorium is a town hall. Do you say that's this one?
What Steve is pointing out that the Ilfeld Auditorium in Las Vegas, which I've never been in, is a John Gaw meme building, as is La Fonda. The architectural history of all the Fred Harvey stuff is something that's always wonderful. So does anybody have any questions?
I have something to say.
Daggett has a question for himself.
Yes.
Well, let Katrina has a question. So Katrina, what's your question?
Well, I was wondering about the Texas Harvey houses, Daggett, and you said that it sounds like they were segregated. Does that mean that there were African-American Harvey girls in Texas, or does it mean they didn't serve African-Americans?
There were plenty of African Americans in Chicago. In Texas, I don't know. I wasn't, they were gone before I came.
He's actually referring to the trains. Keep in mind that the Harvey Company left Texas in the late 1920s. It left its deal with the Frisco Railroad and did not run houses except for Galveston in Texas after that. I think what Dag was referring to is the policies of the trains, of the dining cars on the trains.
No, I'm referring to the fact that I don't know. What I'm saying is I don't know what happened in Texas. There were no Texas Harvey houses that I ever saw operating. In Chicago, they're absolutely integrated, and plenty of black Harvey girls. I managed them, yeah.
It's interesting. I've had people ask about when when did black Harvey girls start? Do you know?
I can tell you when they almost ended, or I almost ended. I operated, my last weeks in Fred Harvey, I operated the restaurants in the Playboy building, which was the Palmolive building in Chicago, and the Kungsholm. Draw your attention to the transfer between the Palmolive building, staid, lovely 30s building, and Hugh Hefner goes in. And we ran the cocktail bar and the restaurant in there. And business is going right down the drain. You remember, we were about the only people on Christmas Eve when we go there. We were patronizing our own places, and we paid. So I had the idea that we'd take the Harvey girl, black and white, which was cut to the mid-calf. And we had a really cute cocktail waitress named Marva. So we brought up the skirt. We brought it to the knee, and then we brought it above the knee. And her tips went through the roof. And the Playboy guys who were in the building, that's marvelous. And Jack Lynch, the regional manager, came out to me and said, "What happened?" I said, "Well, we thought it'd be good for business." He said, "First I'll get fired, and then Marv will get fired, and I think you're going to get fired too." I couldn't help that story, but I remember that. Anyway, sorry.
You had a question here?
Yeah.
Curious about how the Fred Harvey Company was involved in developing Phantom Ranch as part of the Grand Canyon.
I think Steve handled that better than I. Mary Coulter, you can handle that better.
Phantom Ranch was, I don't have the date at the top of my head. Phantom Ranch was created in the teens or the early 20s, if I remember correctly. So it was part of the early development. There was El Tovar. Bright Angel actually had already been there, and they rebuilt it and built a new one. But the trails down into the canyon were a huge part of the business originally. It's now been really dialed back. I mean, there's hardly any mules going down there at all now. But
Hikers, yeah.
The trails were very competitive. And when the Harvey Company came there, some of the trails were owned by other people. So some of the things that were done in the early years of the Grand Canyon, keep in mind the railroad didn't show up there until 1901. So it was the Fred Harvey Company had already existed for quite a few years. And they were competing with people who owned the land or owned rights to the land for the trails. Bright Angel Trail, the closest one there, was owned by somebody else, a guy who hated Fred Harvey. And so the Hermit's Rest and the Hermit's Rest Trail was created to compete with him and to send people down further down to their trails. So there was a chess game going on at the Grand Canyon. Now when you go there, it's all quite copacetic because all the original people are gone. But when you go past like the Kolb studio, I mean, the Kolbs woke up every morning trying to figure out how to put it to Fred Harvey. I mean, they hated Ford Harvey. They never probably met Fred Harvey. But, they had a photography studio forever. And then Fred Harvey set up a photography studio closer to El Tovar to compete with them. So Phantom Ranch was created as part of the chess match to develop the Grand Canyon. This is all before the National Park Service.
Yeah, way before.
And it was a free-for-all there. If you read the stories about the Grand Canyon before they finally took it over by the Park Service and calmed it down, there were people dragging tourists to come to their restaurant, come to their trail. It was bad. So it came out of a desire to both do cool things, because Mary Coulter wanted to do cool things,
Yeah.
but it was very competitive and very much about how do you civilize the Grand Canyon. William Randolph Hearst was still there. He owned the Grand View at that time, and during that time period, he announced that he was going to take over the Grand Canyon, and from his area, for a little piece of Mary Coulter history, so the Grand View was later taken apart, and the logs that you see in the kiva of the watchtower are the original logs from the Grand View Hotel after Hearst gave up. So it was incredibly competitive there then, and Phantom Ranch was built for a combination of the right thing to compete, and because they thought it was a really cool thing to do. It was, and I'm sure you know this too, it was considered the most difficult job at the Grand Canyon, because you worked down there for 2 weeks at a time. I mean, people did not come up at the end of the day if they worked at Phantom Ranch. They worked on 2 week on, 2 week off shifts. And it's still one of the most amazing places. I mean, if you consider there's so few rooms, the frenzy to get those rooms every time they turn over at the beginning of a month is still like one of the most amazing phenomena in the whole hospitality business of the world. But a very cool thing. And I probably will never go there because my wife will never let me hike down into the canyon. Our idea of camping at the Grand Canyon is having a balcony room in El Tovar. Are there any other questions? Yes, press.
In the racial situation, our depot down in El Paso, it opened in 1906, it closed in 1948, and the schematics that we have on it, it shows the restroom for the black gentlemen and the restroom for the ladies, the black ladies. So we always have that. In fact, we have offices where we did them. But I do have one question. I wonder, and you probably don't know the answer, but a long time ago, when
We probably both have different answers.
You answer.
Well, I'll answer because I don't know the answer, but. Oh, I'm sorry. The question is about the origin of the Harvey Gill uniform, the black and whites you're talking about. Yeah, the apron, the traditional, the one, the figure. As a footnote, that was not used in a large number of Fred Harvey operations that I was familiar with, including this hotel, including the Grand Canyon, and quite a few others. It was used, ironically, in the Midwest and originally, so it's a sort of a funny fluctuation of the fashion. It's been described as a combination of a nurse and a nun, and that's a pretty good description. And I think the obvious, simple, scientific answer is they wanted those girls to stay single and unmarried. And so they wanted us as sexless as possible. And they wanted them clean and respectable and a certain amount of distance. So nurse and nun, that's a good formula.
I read a thesis once. I mean, some of the theses that people write about the Harvey girls and Fred Harvey are wild. So one of them talked about the uniform and the fact that it was so hard to put on as part of some, entrenched sexism, and also that the girls had to put on each other's uniforms. You couldn't actually put it on yourself. I think the thing that's important to remember is that the unusual phenomenon was the women themselves. The uniforms became well known, but the uniforms are not that unusual. Okay, I think they're more unusual to find them in the West. But for one simple reason, they're so ridiculously hot. To wear floor-length black wool dresses in the summer, it's like a form of torture. But we can't emphasize that the Harvey Girl uniforms were bought from uniform companies. There's no real indication that they were created in some really unusual, special way. And we have to understand that a lot of the things that the Fred Harvey Company brought to America, because people associated them with Fred Harvey Company, they weren't all things that only the Fred Harvey Company did. Some of the dishes that Fred Harvey Company used, which we associate with Fred Harvey and people spent a lot of money for them on eBay, they were used by other people. They were commercial settings. Membreno was different because it was made just for the Fred Harvey Company, and there were a couple others that were. But what the Harvey Company did was they made special things when they needed them because they were going to be better than what everybody else had.
Put it to Katrina, too. She may know the answer to this.
Katrina
No?
What?
You know?
Do you know the answer?
No, I thought that was interesting.
Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of different, we have pictures of different Harvey Girls uniforms, but until you have the ones here at La Fonda where people were actually making them from scratch and making like ones that were cool and indigenous.
Yeah.
The Harvey Company used a variety of commercial uniforms. It was more the uniformity and the fact that single, smart, interesting women were wearing them in all these places where there weren't that many of those. That was the phenomenon. I don't think anybody claimed that the uniforms were so unusual. They are just, for us, we know of history is what we associate them with.
But you admire the girls that we tell you because we wear those uniforms in El Paso when we get programs. They are very uncomfortable.
And I have to help get rid of.
Oh, I thought you were going to say that you wear them too. I mean, when you raised your hand in the middle of that, I could only wonder what the comment was going to be. Well, the Harvey boys, it could happen any time. Does anybody else have any questions?
Oh, maybe.
Yes, because, and I think what Press is saying, there was a British thing. I mean, part of what the original Harveys, Fred and Ford, spoke with British accents, believed that they were bringing a form of British civilization to America, and they expected their restaurants to feel like everything good about British restaurants, except for like the bad food.
Except for the food.
So it's like a miracle. British restaurant with good food. That is a pretty shocking concept. Do we have any more questions? Well, I want to give Daggett the last word, which he has never gotten with me. So what else do you want to tell us, Daggett?
Well, I guess what occurs to me is history isn't just what happened then. It reminds me of sort of a dreamer wakes and he forgets a lot of his dreams and he wishes he could get them back and he can't. But what Stephen has done and what people in this room respect is to make those dreams and those memories live. And they have power. They are symbolic and they drive the future. So what we do tonight, in a strange obscure way, isn't just to represent and venerate the past, it is to promote the future of a tradition which is excellence and memory and history and human considerations. And so I salute everybody here that has this kind of memory. And it's no accident that it happens in Santa Fe. We talked about this last night. The fact that it happens in Santa Fe is because New Mexico, more than its powerful neighbor to the east and its glamorous neighbor to the west, has a sense of memory going back to the 16th century, which that doesn't happen much in Arizona. But in this town, this is the birthplace of memory, and the memory is the progenitor of the future. And so I salute you guys for being here and keeping it alive, all of you in every way.
That's great. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks. Well done. Thank you.